Good evening. It's good to be here. It's always nice to be able to meet and to take up a study and prepare a lesson. I've enjoyed watching the YouTube lessons as we've gone through the book of Numbers. It's helped me out quite a bit. It's been enjoyable to watch all the men get up and talk about each of these chapters. Tonight we're going to look at Numbers 25. And the title that the author of our lesson plan has put on this is the title, Putting Sin to Death. So if we kind of recap just a little bit of where we are with the Israelite nation, we'll know that they are still on their way to the promised land. Now they're getting very close, but they have not yet gone into the promised land. It is primarily the second generation outside of Moses. Moses is the only one left from the first generation. A little bit earlier, we saw the passing of Aaron and the passing of Miriam, I guess Miriam and then Aaron, and now Moses is left. They've been working their way up the eastern side of the Jordan River through the lands of Moab. And as they've gone through these lands, they've encountered different nations coming to battle against them. Each time, God has delivered them on their way to where they're settling at now. As Steve read just a few minutes ago, they are in Acacia Grove, which, as I said, is just on the other side of the Jordan from Canaan. They'd been close to this area before, only to be turned around, and as we know, they've been wandering around for 40 years now, not due to God's part, but due to their part, their actions, their unbelief, their disobedience. And now they are finally to that point where they can literally see where it is that they've been wanting to go for 40 years. They can look across that river. You would think things would be, pretty good for them, right? I mean, you've seen what's happened with the battles coming up through these lands. I know Danny talked about Balak, and he didn't think he would have to battle him. He thought he could go get Balaam and have him curse the nation of Israel, and thought that, I'll just do it this way. And we know that didn't work out very well for him. Every time he went to curse him, Israel got blessed. So eventually, Balak gets upset and sends Balaam on his way. They go their separate ways. But unfortunately, as we will find out, Balaam comes back and to some degree conspires with Balak to come at the Israelites in a little bit different way. And it's this way that we're going to talk about tonight. You would think after what the Israelites had seen with their exodus, the miracles of God, the way God has been with them, that they would have more trust and more faith in their God. And they just didn't. And what we see in chapter 25 is really an abomination, in my words. It's got so much in it that it's almost unbelievable that this nation would do this sitting where they're sitting, which is literally, again, right across the river from what they know is a land full of milk and honey, right? A land that they're going to be truly blessed in. And the decisions they make are astounding. It shows a disobedience to God and a lack of trust in God. So as we talk about, I won't reread the first 3 verses since Steve just read them, but we see immediately in the first verse what starts to happen with this nation, with these people. They begin to have harlotry. Some versions say they begin to whore with the women of Moab, Moabites and Midianites. From what I read in numerous commentaries, they pretty well were intermingled and lived under one law and one culture. This was a plan by Balaam and Balak. If they couldn't defeat the Israelites in war, if they couldn't curse the Israelites, they thought that this would be the next best way to go after them. The Israelites lived under a strict code, the 10 Commandments. God expected obedience. They didn't always want to obey God, did they? And through the years, and those 40 years wandering around, they got themselves in trouble time and time again, and Moses would have to intercede for them. So they come at the Israelites with this plan, and they immediately start to fornicate, commit sexual immorality with the Moabite women. That leads into, hey, why don't you come to our ceremonies, to our idol worshiping? They weren't too far from Mount Peor. It is speculated that on top of this mountain was the Baal of Peor. This would be our first introduction to the Baals, and this would be why this introduction is, from what I understand, from what I gather, is why this is such a pivotal point in the Israelite nation. They are introduced to the Baals here. Baals meaning there's multiple gods. Baal of Peor signifies all of them as one. And with these idol worshiping, we've seen it over and over in a lot of our studies. We've talked about it in our studies on the 7 churches in Revelations, and we know how just how bad that was for the Israelites. How searching for the word here, but how that contaminated them in such a way, and how it affected them for pretty well the rest of their history. So they're not, they haven't been there very long. They've been wandering around amongst themselves, and now they're basically kind of put in a position where they're back with this pagan world. They can't resist the temptations. Some of them cannot resist the temptations. And because of this, they fall into idol worshiping and sexual immorality, which many times, all the time, those two went hand in hand. And they're immediately breaking God's commandments. They knew they weren't supposed to be in relations with these women. They knew they weren't supposed to be idol worshiping, but yet they just couldn't stop rebelling against God. They couldn't say no. So verse 3, it words it that Israel was joined to the Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Why was the anger of the Lord aroused? It's pretty self-explanatory, I think. we probably can't know absolutely for certain, but you would think that the disappointment he's been through over and over, and yet you have this generation that was promised that they would be the generation to go into the promised land. And this is what they do. This is the thanks he gets. Why did they do it? Who knows? I guess they just couldn't get out of the way. But we know, as is often the case, that this disobedience to God will come at a price. And it comes at a very severe, very stiff penalty. In this case, the Lord gives the commandment to hang all the chiefs of the people in the sun before the Lord. And we're not necessarily talking about like the old westerns were hanging from a tree. The idea that they project here is they were impaled upon a post where they would hang in the sun, and that would be basically a monument out there to, this is what you've done, this is what happens. So obviously the second generation did not learn from the first generation. If we remember in Exodus 32, when the first generation made the golden calf, they aroused the anger of the Lord, and the command was given to kill those that participated in that. But if we look a little further, keep reading, and we go down to verse 6, it says, and indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle meeting. So the whole nation is weeping at the door of the tabernacle, at the front of the tabernacle. They have seen what they've done. They are mourning for the sins that they have committed. They know they've done wrong. And they're weeping for this. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, so the grandson of Aaron, the priest, saw this man present this Midianite woman, he arose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman, through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. So in the midst of this weeping, you have a man come strolling through in front of God, in front of Moses, in front of all of his brothers and sisters weeping, in spite of the decree that God had set forth through Moses. In spite of all this, just come strolling through as if to say, I really don't care. I'll do what I want. There's not a lot you can do about it. Well, there was something that someone did about it, because Phinehas was so enraged by this that he murdered that man and that woman in their chamber. I would say it would take a lot of courage to do something like that, to be able to take action, maybe not knowing what the consequence would be, but just out of your love and your devotion and your obedience to God, to be able to take that stand. I'd say that, that it would still be hard to do, but it was something that he felt he needed to do. And as a Levite, it was his job to keep the holiness of God, to protect that holiness. We read earlier in the book of Numbers, when they set the campsites out, where were the Levites? They were in the middle. They surrounded the tabernacle. They were to protect the tabernacle. They were to keep it holy, keep God holy. That was their job, and he did his job. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for God and made atonement for the children of Israel. Phinehas took action. He did what he had to do. And when he did this, the plague stopped. After 24,000 people died, his action was an atonement. God stopped the plague. As I said, as a Levite and as a priest, it was his duty to uphold God's holiness. But even his grandfather didn't do that, did he? Moses and Aaron, did they get to enter the promised land? They did not. As Danny said in his lesson, remember their wording, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And the Lord told them that they did not uphold him as holy in the eyes of the people, and thus they would not enter the promised land. But let's see what God says about Phinehas. In Psalms 106, 28 through 31, then they yoked themselves to Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. They provoked the Lord to anger with their deeds, and a plague broke out among them. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stayed, and that was counted to him as righteousness from generation to generation forever. This act of holiness and zealousness for God was counted to him as righteousness from generation to generation forever. Phinehas had a true faith in God, and such pursued things that were holy. So if God counted it to Phinehas as righteousness by acting for God's holiness, then we can conclude that the pursuit of holiness is the path of faith. Walking by faith means pursuing holiness in all areas of our life. So, how does this relate to us? How do we take what we see here in Numbers 25, outside of this looking like it come out of a Hollywood movie with everything that was going on? We need to understand that the holiness of God, and that we need to understand the holiness of God, and that God does not tolerate sin. Just like Phinehas didn't tolerate what that Israelite man did. The Israelites just didn't get this. And time again, they sinned against God, and Moses would have to go intercede for them. We need to remember that defiant, rebellious sin like that of the Israelite man cannot be ignored. You know, during this lesson, the author of these lessons talks about this being kind of a upper hand sin, this defiant, rebellious sin. And Michael Woodring, I believe, talked about it as well in his. You know, you can sin and you can go back. You know, we all sin. There's not a one of us in this room that's not going to sin again. But you mourn for your sins. You repent for your sins. But to brazenly act the way this man acted is wrong, is the defiance. And you see that, probably not, some more than others, but a whole lot in our generation, in our culture today. People just, they can care less. Whether it comes to sexual immorality or murder, you know, killing people because whatever reason they want, people just can care less, just like this man did. But these types of sin just cannot be ignored, and that falls on us as members of the church, as Christians, that when we see things like this, we need to step in like Phinehas. I don't recommend grabbing a spear and killing anybody. You might not get away with it in today's culture like he did. But we need to step in, and we need to try to correct the brother and sister or whoever it may be. You know, Paul was quick to stand up to rebellious actions. If you remember in 1 Corinthians 5, what the church had going on there with the sexual immorality again. You know, it's kind of a theme through these churches and living in the pagan world and the idol worshiping. And the culture probably washed them out so much that, you know, again, it was just normal for these types of things. And as abnormal as this situation was, you know, Paul condemned them. You know, they needed to do something. And as I said, we need to do something as well when we see it. Point 3 that I like to make is we need more Phinehas's in the Lord's church. We need to be more zealous about our holiness and willing to defend our God, but we also need to build our faith so we can uphold his holiness. I'm pretty sure Phinehas just didn't, you know, was kind of strumming along his whole life and then all of a sudden figured out, oh, hey, that guy's really wrong. I need to do something about it. Phinehas was a holy man from all intents and purposes. He was a faithful man because through this faith, and he knew what he had to do. He knew he had to defend God's holiness. Another point I'd like to make is God keeps his promises. We talk a lot about this in the New Christians class that we do. But think about that generation, the second generation. Were they more righteous than the first? No. Did they deserve to go into the promised land more than the first generation? I wouldn't think so. But God had promised them that they would go in. He promised that first generation, the generation after you will enter the promised land. Even through all the rebellions, the moaning and groaning and complaining, God provided food for them, and they didn't like it, and Moses and Aaron were in it for themselves, and his laws were too strict, and through all this moaning and groaning, all this defiance, this disobedience, but yet he still was with them through the battles, was with them through Balaam. He saw them through the victories that they needed to go through so they would be the ones to enter the promised land. Point 5 is Jesus came to this earth to put sin to death. And that's really what the point of this lesson's about, putting sin to death. The parallel I think you can draw here is with Phinehas. He was counted as righteousness, and would be basically that priesthood would last generation through generation through his family. So Israel would always have that intercessor, right? They would always have someone that would be able to go to God on their behalf. Jesus is our intercessor. He is our forever priest. He will be there for us always. So you can draw that parallel with that. He came here to put sin to death, and therefore we need to put sin to death as well. If you look at Romans 8:12 through 13, it says, "So then, brothers, we are debtors not to the flesh, to living according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live." We're at a constant war with the flesh. We are we're in a battle, right? We're in a war. We have to constantly think about defending ourselves, defending our innocence, our Christianity, so we can defend the holiness of God. God sends a powerful picture, not only in this event, but throughout the book of Numbers, that sin must be put to death. It's not acceptable, no matter what our culture today may say. God does not tolerate it, and neither can we. We don't want to be like the Israelite man and be callous, be rebellious, brazen. When we get to that point, it's might be too far gone. We might lose ourselves in this culture, in this world, and there'll be a judgment on us one day if we're like that. Guaranteed, God's going to judge us, and He's going to know how rebellious we were, how defiant. We need to look at the Israelite nation in this particular case and what they did when they mourned their sins. And they were weeping and they were repentive, for they knew what they had done and how bad it was. And sure, they would do many more things. This introduction to the Baals was something that would be with them for a very long time, something that would be dealt with. But we need to be mournful, and we need to turn to God when we know we've sinned, when we know we've been wrong, and let Jesus be our intercessor, because He will always be there for us and willing to do that, just as Moses time and time again was the intercessor for the Israelites. That's all I have. The lesson's yours. and have a good evening.